Nearly a decade ago, a Georgia woman was riding in the car with her husband and friend on a weekend trip. But everything changed when she muttered the words, "Tex, you shot me." So was it an accident or murder?
And based upon the trajectory of the bullet and the injuries to Diane, he concluded that the gun was aimed at her back. It wasn't on her lap, it didn't accidentally discharge, it was aimed right at her back.
The evidence will not show that the gun went off magically or by itself. It was in Tex's lap, in his hand, when it was discharged. And when we say accidental, what we mean is that the shooting wasn't intentional.
Now, many years after the deadly shooting, the man who shot and killed his wife is already out of prison. Let's go back a few years to September 25th of 2016. Danny Jo Carter was behind the wheel when she heard a bang and saw her best friend Diane McIver slumping over. But there was someone else in the car, Diane's husband, Claude Lee McIver, better known as Tex. And no, the prominent attorney isn't from the Lone Star State. He made a name for himself in the Peach State. He was a partner at a national labor and employment firm and at the time practicing law since 1973. Back to Diane. She was rushed to a hospital, but not the nearest hospital they could find. Instead, another one. And when he was asked by hospital staff what happened, his answer, an accident. Diane McIver died at the hospital hours after she was rushed there. As for her husband, the prominent lawyer turned into a defendant when he was charged with his wife's death 3 months later. He went to trial 2 years later in 2018. Now, the prosecution painted the picture that it wasn't an accident, and McIver wanted his wife's money.
From 2013 to 2016, our financial expert, Mr. Dean Driscoll, will testify that he received $198,000 from Diane McIver. In addition to the $198,000 that he received from her, she gave him a loan for $350,000 in 2011. This wasn't a, hey, you can pay me back whenever you get the money. This was an actual loan with a promissory note. And the loan was secured by the ranch out in Putnam County. And based on his financial condition, the defendant would not be able to repay this loan. In fact, the evidence will show that in 2011, when she gave him the loan, it was due in 2014, and he hadn't paid it. So she renewed it, so they would be due in December of 2017. And the evidence will show that over that period, he made interest-only payments and never paid any money on the principal.
The state said in the months after Diane's death, her husband auctioned off her belongings. McIver said he was advised by his attorneys to sell his wife's things to fulfill her will's responsibilities, and they maintained it was a horrible accident.
When we say accidental, what we mean is that the shooting wasn't intentional. And I think there are kind of 5 key takeaways you'll see from the forensic evidence that will show to you that this was not intentional. First, as I said, the gun was resting on Tex's lap when it was discharged. Second, it was fired from a sideways position. That's what I was demonstrating for you before, that when Tex was kind of, laid back in the car, sort of slumped down, the gun is in his lap in this sideways position. It's not pointed upright. It's not like this. It's not back by his hip. It is in his lap.
You might be wondering, why would Tex McIver have a gun out in the first place? Well, he reportedly feared they would be carjacked because of what he claims to be heightened tension following the Black Lives Matter protests. During McIver's trial, though, there was one eyewitness who gave her account of what happened, Danny Jo Carter, Diane's best friend, who was driving the car when Diane was shot.
I heard a big boom, and I didn't know what it was. I thought there was an explosion somewhere. And my head turned to the right, and I looked out the window and wondered where there was an explosion or if somebody behind us was getting ready to hit us or something had happened behind us. I did not realize that it was a gunshot right away.
How did it sound?
It was loud.
And so can you tell the jurors what happened next?
Diane turned around. She turned around this way. She flung around and she says, "Tex, what did you do?"
Tex, what did you do? And did he say anything?
He said the gun discharged.
And so, what did you do when Diane McIver turned around to look?
When she turned around, I turned around and realized seconds. This was all happening in seconds. And I saw a puff of smoke, and I could see his hands. And I could see the top of the gun, I could see part of the gun, his hands, and some of the bag.
Okay.
And his hand was moving like this.
Show the jurors again what you saw.
Something like this.
Danny Jo testified they were at a stop when the gun went off, which didn't match Tex McIver's earlier statement where he said the car hit a bump when it was accidentally fired. She said McIver asked her to change her story once they got to the hospital, and she responded, "I can't lie." The trial lasted nearly a month. Right before the jury was set to deliberate the case, McIver's defense attorneys asked the judge to give jurors the option to find the lawyer guilty of misdemeanor involuntary manslaughter instead of murder. But the judge said no. So when the jury deliberated, they asked a bunch of questions. But probably the most important one was, if the jury finds Tex not guilty on all other counts, can he still be guilty of influencing a witness? So you can imagine a little where their heads were at. But then on April 24th of 2018, they reached a surprising verdict.
We find the defendant not guilty on count 2, felony murder. We find the defendant guilty of felony murder. On count 3, aggravated assault, we find the defendant guilty. On count 4, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, we find the defendant guilty. On count 5, influencing a witness, we find the defendant guilty.
So guilty on all counts except malice murder. That next month, Tex McIver was sentenced to the rest of his life in prison, but with the chance of parole. So like many people, they thought the case ended there. That is, until 4 years later, when the Georgia Supreme Court made a stunning ruling about his appeal. They ruled to overturn McIver's conviction. Now, remember when I said his defense team wanted the jurors to consider a lesser charge and the judge said no? Well, that was the root of McIver's conviction being overturned. In their ruling, the Georgia Supreme Court wrote, quote, "He appeals asserting among other enumerations of error that the trial court erred in refusing his request to charge the jury on the less grade of involuntary manslaughter, and in allowing the state to introduce allegedly inadmissible and prejudicial evidence and make improper comments during closing arguments. We conclude that the trial court erred in refusing McIver's request to charge on the lesser grade of involuntary manslaughter because the charge was authorized by law and some evidence supported the giving of the charge." So while that ruling was made in 2022, it didn't mean McIver was going to walk out of prison that day. The Fulton County DA's office said back in 2022 they were fully prepared to retry McIver all over again. But last January, prosecutors offered him a deal. Plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter, get 8 years with credit for time served, then you're free to go. And he was. Online records from the Georgia Department of Corrections show he was released on January 9th of this year and is now on parole. A wild case plus a stunning ruling. Now the man who was convicted of killing his wife is out of prison. I'm joined now by criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor Bob Bianchi. Bob, always great to see you. Let's kind of go back to how we got here. McIver, his wife, and a friend were on a weekend trip. McIver claimed at the time a gun went off, killed his wife. But do you buy that? Do you think that this was all an accident, as the defense has kind of portrayed it to be?
You know, listen, when I was covering this trial, the motive of the prosecution never really made sense to me. And while you don't need motive in order to prove a murder case, as a former homicide prosecutor, this is going to be really, really significant to me in making the distinction between whether something was a reckless act, an accident that caused the death, or whether this was an actual purposeful and knowing death. And look, Tex McIver's an attorney, he's a smart guy. If there was like the worst way to try to murder somebody, it would be this way. I mean, there's so many other more creative ways to do it. Not that it couldn't happen, but to do it in a car, when it's moving, with a witness, it just seemed like really clunky to me. Second point, during the trial, I became very, very concerned about two things. The expert testimony that the state was using. We're finding out more and more that this expert, like I've tried many murder cases, and this whole thing about being able to tell the trajectory of a bullet and how it goes through a seat and what it means and how far it was is an extremely inexact science. And I wouldn't be surprised if eventually the courts start to eliminate that kind of evidence from being used. And then lastly was the manner in which the court charged the jury, or in essence, in this particular case, failed to charge the jury with some things that were really, really important to give the jury a better opportunity to fit the case into where where the facts were, as opposed to jamming them down between the two draconian positions of outright acquittal and not guilty, or the harshest charge, which is murder. And ultimately, and I think we'll get into this, that is what ultimately led to a reversal of this conviction. But I got to be honest with you, the case made me uneasy. And as a former homicide prosecutor, to me, I would have liked a lot more, because that motive evidence was not really compelling to me.
Yeah, and let's kind of talk about that. Of course, we'll get more into the reversal in just a second. But the prosecution claiming that this was all about the money. Why did you not buy kind of that explanation of the motive there?
You join every single marriage or every union or every partnership. I mean, you are entangled financially, whatever. God forbid ever something happened to me, my family, my wife, my friends, the people I know. You can always say, well, it was a financial motive. Oh, they have an insurance policy. Oh, look, you learn, if you've been doing this long enough, to be very, very careful before you jump to conclusions, because things at face value can appear to be one way, but it's really something different. And if you're an astute observer of human nature and you've witnessed this, then you would know that a lot of times what you claim to be something or see appears to be something. For example, when people lie, one of the greatest interviewers that I know as a tactical operations captain in my prosecutor's office always said, be careful, because they may be lying for some other reason, but not necessarily because they committed the crime. And just like here, in this instance, Tex McIver's defense was, I had the gun, I was in a bad neighborhood, I took the gun out, and then for whatever reason, the gun may have misfired. Have I been involved in situations in which things like that have happened? I've seen cops misfire their guns and they go off. This is not an uncommon thing. So with this kind of motive that he was having difficulty financially and that she was more successful to him, to be honest with you, Elizabeth, when this was going on, I'm like, that to me is more of a defense. That's more of a reason to actually need her, because his financial life wasn't going. And to go to the position where just because there's financial stress or that somebody may have an insurance policy would be the reason that you would kill somebody that you love and are married to is something that I'm very circumspect, unless there's other evidence that leads me to confirm that bias. I think they jumped to conclusions and put a square peg in the round hole.
Yeah, it's interesting kind of hearing your take, given that you were kind of on both sides of the tables, both being a former prosecutor and being a criminal defense attorney. Obviously, we know the case was tried. He was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison. But then that conviction was overturned. Since the Georgia Supreme Court, they had said, the trial court erred in denying McIver's request to charge the jury on a lesser, that being involuntary manslaughter there. What do you kind of make of that ruling, and do you agree with it?
Absolutely, I agree with it. This was either amateur hour on behalf of the prosecutors and the judge, or a purposeful attempt to basically get the guy convicted. We all know, as prosecutors who try homicide cases, and as a judge especially, one of the few roles that the judge really plays in a case, the most important role, is reading at the end of the case what's called a jury charge or jury instructions. This is the law that is given to the jurors, and the jurors have to stay within the guardrails of those jury instructions. And many cases are reversed because the judge did not properly explain the law to the jury. So what happened here? And by the way, before I get what happened here, and as a prosecutor, there have been times where I've seen a judge getting ready to make a mistake that may be even favorable to me as a prosecutor, but I would stop the judge and say, no, Your Honor, I think you're wrong on the law there, and here's why. Why would I do that as a prosecutor? Because you've heard me yell and scream for many years that getting a conviction that ultimately gets reversed serves nobody. It doesn't serve the victim, doesn't serve justice, and it's just a waste of time. In this particular case, here's what went on. The jury literally came back with a question that said, can we find him not guilty on everything and still find him guilty on the tampering charge? So anybody reading that, well, I know we're not allowed to do that. Well, we're not allowed to in court, but we are allowed here at the Law&Crime Network, can say that the jury was inclined to maybe say not guilty on all the charges but the tampering charge. What the judge did not charge here was involuntary manslaughter. Now, the whole defense was that this was a mistake, that this was an accident. The conduct may have been reckless, which is a conscious disregard for a known risk. It may have been reckless, but it didn't rise to the level of a purposeful or knowing murder. So this is what I was talking about before. When the defense asked for that charge to be given and the judge denied it, he put the jury in a space, the judge, where they could only go for the most serious conviction or nothing, between a rock and a hard place. And when that happens, the jury may feel disinclined to just let him off the hook completely, but they also don't want to convict him of the most serious offense. And that is why the law says if there is evidence in the case where a jury could reasonably conclude that it was something other than murder, in this case, involuntary manslaughter or recklessness, the judge must charge it. And the appellate courts ruled that very thing. The judge made a mistake, an error in the jury charge, and as a result of that, they reversed the murder conviction. If you want, you can ask me another question, but I got one step further, but I'll leave it there for this. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, given your take on the prosecution's case, first of all, but also, are you surprised, because Fonnie Willis, she seemed kind of gung-ho to retry Tex McIver. Obviously, that was in her district. But are you surprised that prosecutors ended up offering McIver a plea deal so that way he could avoid that second trial?
No, I'm not surprised. I think it was the right thing to do. I think the case settled for what the value of the case really was, in essence, factually. But look, Fonnie Willis, and I've been saying this forever, and that district attorney's office, I have to say, like, what is happening here? I mean, they are a constellation of multiple cases where there's multiple missteps, multiple over prosecutions, sloppiness, reversals, recusals, removals. I mean, honestly, it's just a bad situation there. So it does not surprise me. When I was the county prosecutor and I ran all my assistant prosecutors, we had an ethos. We had a culture. We were very circumspect about the charges we charged. Could we prove them beyond a reasonable doubt or not? Now, this case got that's why my prosecutors would never have said, no, don't charge involuntary manslaughter. They would have recognized you should charge it, because if you don't, it's going to be reversed. Now you have to come back as a prosecutor and try a case a second time. The case never gets better the second time. And so I think that they had that issue. Plus, let's be honest here. Had the judge charged involuntary manslaughter, remember that first jury question? Many could argue that Tex McIver actually got shafted and should never have been retried again because it was such an egregious error, because the jury seemed to be saying they wanted to find him not guilty of the actual death. But we'll never know the answer to that. But he was going for retrial. He was facing all those charges again. And he basically pled guilty with all the time that he had in there. It basically was the prosecutor giving the case away, recognizing it had been irreparably harmed at that point in time.
And obviously, we know Tex McIver was a prominent attorney in the Georgia area. Do you think any part of you thinks that he might have just kind of played the system a little bit?
No, not he did. I see people say that a lot. I find it to be quite the opposite. My 30 plus years of experience as a criminal trial lawyer, I do agree that people who are wealthy or who are famous, so we see this all the time with Jay-Z and Diddy and Bill Cosby or Harvey Weinstein and all these kind of people. It is true that before law enforcement pulls a trigger, if you will, on those people and charges them, that they get a lot more breaks than the average person. That has been my experience because of the notoriety of the case. I don't know, for multiple constellation of reasons. But once those charges are filed, it's been my experience the defendants are actually then treated more unfairly because of the very publicity of the case. So I don't think that his standing in any of this, in my mind, the biggest issue that we have, and again, another beef of mine that maybe the audience is tired of hearing me say, is that when we have these elected district attorneys who are essentially given a job by the people, and if you don't do what the people want, what the court of public opinion wants, it may cost you your job. You start making poor decisions. You start doing things. Look, we've had prosecutors literally campaigning lately, which I think is anathema. I can't even believe it. I've been complaining about this for years, but literally campaigning on people that they're going to prosecute if they get into office. This is not justice. This is not fairness. So I don't think McIver got any kind of breaks here. I think that he stood trial on a case where a jury was conflicted about whether to find him guilty or not. He was abused by the system because prosecutors did not allow, and the judge did not allow the involuntary manslaughter charge to be put in there. So if anything, I think the guy got put through the ringer.
Right. Well, Bob Bianchi, it was kind of interesting and great to hear your take on all of this. Before we sign you off, though, well, one, I appreciate your time as always, per usual. But I do have to ask, what do you think Tex McIver is kind of thinking now that he's out of prison right now? He had credit for time served. He served about 8 years, I believe it is. But what do you think he's thinking now that he's probably back at home?
Let's look at this from the lens that maybe this was an accident. We don't know for sure. We weren't there, but let's look at it that way. I mean, to me, just shooting somebody in the back in the car with somebody there is just doesn't make sense to me. But if it is, he has spent 8 years in prison. He has lost his license to practice law. He has lost his reputation. He has lost his standing in the community. It's likely he's never going to be able to earn a living again. And he is now, his reputation throughout the world has been sullied and it'll never be coming back. There are people that heat him with the greatest passion and vigor you can possibly think of. And if that is true, that it's just a mistake, spending 8 years in prison for something where, if it was a mistake, you killed your own wife. On top of it, you have to live with the guilt of all that. We talk a lot of times in the criminal justice process about prosecutors need to be more aware of the collateral consequences. It's a lot more than just jail. His life is destroyed. So do I think that he's like gleefully, I'm sure he's happy he's out of jail. It's a terrible place to be. I'm sure he served his time very hard as a professional who was, the fall from grace has been significant. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. Now, if he did do it, he probably isn't happy he had to do jail time, but he's happy he got out and he didn't spend a lot more time in jail. So, I mean, I guess it all depends on what the truth of the situation is.
All right. Again, excellent insight there, Bob. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure as always.
Tex McIver will be on probation for the next 7 years under his plea deal. He also was ordered to stay away from people including Diane's former boss and Danny Joe Carter, who was driving the car when Diane was shot. McIver maintains he never intended to hurt his wife. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.